Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies. We're getting started a little late. There was some confusion about the address. We're giving people a chance to wander between the two buildings. But it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the beginning of the continuation from last night of our symposium, Slums, New Envisions for an Enduring Global Phenomena. My first job as the introducer is to thank various folks. This is an event that has been conceived, planned, and executed by three organizations. My own organization, the Joint Center for Housing Studies, joint between the Graduate School of Design and the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, with Rahul Malhotra and the Urban Planning Department of the Graduate School of Design, and with Mac McCarthy, Enrique Silva, and Martin Smolka of the Lincoln Land Institute. And so really been a very productive collaboration between those three organizations. We've also benefited from support of the Lakshma Mittal and Family South Asian Institute of Harvard, who is in the facility we're being hosted in today, and by the Loeb Fellowship as well. So thanks to those organizations as well. I don't want to belabor a framing of the event. Rahul did a wonderful job last night of framing some of the key issues that we're hoping to address. Just a few things to remark on. One, there's been some discussion around the fact of the use of the word slums. And obviously, that part of the discussion we'll probably have over the next 2 days will be around language and how we name this phenomena. We had chosen the word slums in part to be provocative, in part because of the fact that, as the title notes, this is an enduring global phenomena, and slums is the word that has the longest history. And so we're using that to connote that this is an issue that has been around for 2 centuries, at least as a named issue, if not longer, certainly than that. The other issue, I think, that's at the center of the framing of this event, as it was beginning to be conceived and was reflected in last night's event and the focus of it, the view of slums in cinema, is that over time, the way in which slums are conceived then denotes what the solution should be. If we connote slums as being inadequate housing, the solution is to make housing adequate. If the issue is informality of land tenure, the solution is to formalize land tenure. And I think the basic premise is that each of those conceptions, while might have some truth in it, ignores other realities. And so the need is to have a broader conception of slums that reflect the full reality of the situation in order to come up with a more holistic solution. In order to do that, one of the premises behind this event, too, was that they have to have many, many disciplines reflected, present in the room to bring their different lenses. Because for each of us, what we're trained in, our tools become our hammer and the problem becomes a nail. And so if you don't have those different perspectives in the room, you won't have a more holistic response. And importantly, among those lenses is not just academic disciplines, but also the views of communities. And so we've worked to make sure that we have folks representing the communities present in the room as well. As we conceived of this, there's two aspects of the event that are reflected really in the structure of today and tomorrow. The first is that in order to think about new solutions, it does help to look backward and say, how have we conceived of slums in the past, and what have we learned from those conceptions, attempts at solutions, as it were, and lessons learned from that. And so today there's a bit more of a look back and a look at the kind of current conditions. And then tomorrow, where I think much of the energy will come, is more of a look forward and saying what are the new visions and the new solutions for this global phenomena. So I'm very excited now to begin this with this first panel, Slums, a Critical Analysis, which will be chaired by Alejandro de Castro Mazarro, who is about to become a postdoctoral researcher at the Leibniz Institute of Ecological, Urban, and Regional Development. Alejandro also, I should point out, is someone who was a real moving force in the conceiving of this event and helping to carry it through. So I'm very grateful to Alejandro for all his work in bringing us to this point. I think it's quite appropriate that he kicks us off. So Alejandro, with that, please lead us into the discussion.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good morning. Slums are part of a cosmology of terms and concepts, extending to different geographies and times, and which depict a certain urban otherness we mentioned yesterday that exists in a somewhat problematic condition. Even when in the past, and even surprisingly today, slums were seen as anomalies, there is a growing agreement that slums and the myriad of concepts that you can see as appearing here are systemic in a way to modern urbanization or to the modern making of urbanization. They said there is a very heated debate about what root causes in industrialization, globalization, mercantilism, capitalism have triggered the rise of slums to our present and unprecedented urban condition. The term slums and these other that we see have the incredible ability, and perhaps that's a reason we are addressing them here, have the incredible ability to encapsulate the social aspects of these problems into something that can be pinpointed with the hand, meaning something that occupies a space. They offer, as a concept, they offer the possibility to translate urban social issues into spatial and material issues. And for this reason, the stakes for defining what ultimate problem, root, or question slums are have been very high. This conceptual debate has been, however, very problematic. Whatever problematic conditions slums may define remains elusive after more than 200 years, and at the same time has been overly defined. Even more, its very definition has been pervasive and used in favor for those in power to define. In the US case, for example, when the use of the term urban blight in redevelopment policies of the 1950s fostered racial segregation and unjustifiable evictions. It seems that slums attempt to designate a certain urban problem or condition, but it also seems to be the expression of disapproval of people entitled to disapprove. In this context, the panel we are having this morning aims to disrupt the received notions of slums by highlighting the range of processes, logics, and motivations through which slums have been historically constructed, represented, and often assimilated into the urban imagination. Our panel, Slums, a Critical Analysis, will situate the rise and arc traced by the concept of slums with a focus on the conditions under which public authorities and intellectuals have coined them. As we mentioned yesterday, we will not give full introductions of the speakers to, in a way, save paper and also save time, knowing that in the website of the conference you have a full description of each speaker's bio. So I will so to discuss this historical and conceptual issue, we'll have three presentations, and I will briefly name them. We'll have a presentation by Jorge Francisco Liernur, founding dean of the School of Architecture and director of the Center for Contemporary Architecture Studies at the University Torcuato de Tella in Buenos Aires. Charlotte Vorms, lecturer at the University of Paris and co-editor-in-chief and co-founder of the online journal Metropolis. And Peter Ward, C.B. Smith Centennial Chair in U.S.-Mexico Relations and Professor of Public Affairs and Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. I have to say that the selection and the framing of this session and others and of the speakers has been of high, has been made after a lot of discussion and debate. So I'm very happy to have our three speakers presenting this topic. The presentations of around 12 minutes will be followed with discussions and Q&A with the public. We'll start, not unlike in this document, we'll start from Pancho Liernur, then Charlotte, and then Peter Ward.
Okay, good morning. The title of my presentation is An Odd Couple, Reflections on the Formation of the Upgrading Paradigm. The expansion of urban slums as a massive third world phenomenon started to be recognized after World War II, considered as a circumstantial expression of an insufficient offer of houses. Slums were identified as urban anomalies, and governmental agencies promoted their eradication and their replacement by low-cost housing estates. Because the phenomenon did not stop to grow, in the second half of the 70s, a new paradigm was adopted with the support of technicians, financiers, politicians, and public opinion, based on the ideas of routing, upgrading, and self-help. Nevertheless, in spite of the immense resources dedicated to support these ideas, UN studies tell us that the amount of slum dwellers did not stop to grow. Has the moment come to consider this second paradigm in crisis? In order to think about this question, I'll try to examine how and why it acquired the extraordinary global consensus that made of it a matter of common sense. The formation of this paradigm was the result of an intricate net of numerous ideas, beliefs, representations, and interests that was woven through the action of individuals and institutions, and it is not my intention to examine it in this brief commentary. I will not address my attention to the agency of the establishment, but to the alternative cultural and political field that orbits around the ideas of Karl Marx. It is my intention to show that in spite of taking place in Cold War times, the consensus on the second paradigm would have not been possible without ideological coincidences between the conservative right and the radical left. Let's begin with Marx's definition of the value of labor power. As, I quote, the value of the means of subsistence necessary for the maintenance of the laborer. With other necessities like food and clothing, housing is part of this means of subsistence, determined by concrete, I quote again, climatic and other physical conditions, and by what he calls the degree of civilization of a country. For this reason, quote again, in contradistinction to the case of other commodities, there enters into the determination of the value of labor power a historical and moral element. Marx argues that, I quote, the minimum limit of the value of labor power is determined by the value of the commodities physically indispensable for the survival and reproduction of the laborer. On his side, the value of the house is conditioned by the price of its building materials plus the price of the plot plus the surplus of the owner or the real estate agent who produced it as a commodity. In Marxist terms, a fraction of the price of the house should be included in the value to be paid to the worker. In capitalist societies, writes Marx, the working class is formed by both an industrial army of active workers, I'm quoting, and an industrial reserve army with an intermittent participation in the productive process. But out of this process, there is another segment of the society identified by him as the Lumpenproletariat. Because the high prices of the urban land, intermittent workers and Lumpenproletarians are usually pushed to the most degraded zone. In an extremely tight synthesis, we have here the basic components of the housing question in Marxist debates: the protagonist, the house as a commodity, the territory. But there is another point to consider. Being part of the life of the worker outside the process of production, what is the role of the housing question in regards to class struggle? Should it be considered, as Engels wrote in his famous essay of 1872, just, I quote, one of the numerous smaller secondary evils which result from the present-day capitalist mode of production, which will be solved with a social revolution by abolishing the capitalist mode of production? What is the role of the moral elements mentioned before? The problem of shantytown was recognized as a serious issue upon noticing their massive expansion in Latin America in coincidence with the emergence of the new independent countries in Africa and Asia. According to the words of some social and economic experts, the solution was not possible following the path traveled by the developed countries. They sustain that for political and social reasons, the precarious settlements should be eradicated, but there was not other possibility than to work on the moral elements by lowering functional and material standards and to translate the cost of housing to the workers and lumpenproletarians in terms of labor time by reducing their own private time through the incorporation of strategies of self-help, site and services, growing units, or similar. Under the leadership of establishment figures like Jacob Crane, Charles Abrams, or Ernst Weissmann, these were the policies promoted by the United Nations during the 50s and 60s all over the world. On the contrary, especially after the 20th Congress of the USSR Communist Party, Soviet bloc leaders sustained that a socialist state could use part of the surplus that capitalists had extracted to the workers by investing it in the modernization of building industry. In this way, by means of massively prefabricated units located in state-owned urban sites, the price of the houses would drastically fall down. Like happened in Cuba or in Allende's Chile, Western Marxists who adhered to Soviet bloc criteria followed this interpretation. From this point of view, because the core of the class struggle were the production centers, the conflicts belonging to the spheres of circulation and consume were still considered, in terms of Engels, a secondary evil. Even into the frame of a productivist interpretation, there was an ambiguous topic, based mainly on Engels' ideas, but also on some Marx writings. The promotion of cooperative forms of production had an important place in Marxist debates. In the 20s and 30s, housing cooperatives were in the core of social democratic policies in Europe. Moreover, for some leaders, cooperatives were a way of access to a new mode of production alternative to capitalism. Supported by Soviet bloc ideologues, but also by their Marxist critics, the cooperative housing solution was a valid reference at the moment of the emergence of the upgrading paradigm. But substantially, it was against Soviet and para-Soviet productivist interpretation that critical Marxist readings of the slums were sustained. They were stimulated by Trotsky's denouncings of bureaucratic condition of the Soviet state, Gramsci's understanding of culture, the moral elements, as an important field of class struggle, Mao's populist defense of peasants' role in the revolution, the discovery of the idealist Marx of the economic and philosophical manuscripts, the impact of existentialism in Marxists like Jean-Paul Sartre, Che Guevara, or Pier Paolo Pasolini, situationist and Henri Lefebvre's readings of the city, the radical and anti-Western position of third world leaders like Franz Fanon, and post-structuralist philosophy. In spite of their rejection of Marxism, or perhaps because of it, a mention should be done to the fundamental role of the British anarchists. The promotion of self-organized popular actions and their concrete defense of freedom to build, no plan, and housing by people were determinant in the adoption of the upgrading paradigm. And we should not forget the Marxist-Catholic dialogue and the place of the worker priest after the Second Vatican Council defending the integrity and identity of their faithful communities in the slums. The contribution of this net of ideas could be synthesized in the following three topics. One, the characterization of the slum dwellers. Being or not incorporated to the industrial work, since the first registers of their existence, the inhabitants of these precarious settlements came from the countryside. Many Latin American scholars understood these segments of the societies as marginal. For some, a transitory conditions. For others, a permanent part of social formation dependent of imperialist powers. The latter argued that the slum dwellers were neither workers nor a minority of lumpen proletarians, but a new kind of marginal mass that will never be incorporated to an economic scheme determined by external and not internal logics. After the Cuban Revolution and the many liberation movements exploded in ex-colonial countries, the slums inhabited by these marginal masses were considered as potential liberated territories of peasants surrounding the cities of the bourgeoisie. Moreover, constructing with formal workers' organizations captured by and incorporated to establishment, and with the alienated petit bourgeoisie, slums dwellers were celebrated in their authenticity, in their creativity, in their resilience, and in their social solidarity. Policies of eradication were identified as counter-revolutionaries. Slums have to be defended as anti-bourgeois citadels of a new world. 2. The role of slums in regard to the cities. Planning and modernist urbanism experienced a growing crisis in the post-war decades. Demands of more organic approaches to the city and the reconsideration of the advantages of the historical urban centers were the order of the day. Moreover, from US African American ghettos and Parisian bidonville to the ecologists and the third world slum dwellers, it became evident that a specific kind of demands on matters belonging to the realm of life outside the production processes could not anymore considered as secondary evils. The question of space, an until this moment underestimated topic, was introduced in Marxist debates, and the cities were attributed a major role in the process of reproduction of capital. With this, concepts like the right of the city and rebel cities became powerful ideological topics in the alternative readings of slums. Not only were they considered as having the right to integrate the formal urban environment, but they were presented as models to follow, especially since rhizomatic formations started to be appreciated as paradigms of flexible organization. Finally, third, the technical solution. Into the context of third world and or humanist Marxism, the adoption of advanced technologies was associated either with imperialism and big international companies or with bureaucratic Soviet bloc communism. Therefore, Morrison appraisal of craft techniques was revived by the promotion of vernacular and traditional building materials as an ideological and aesthetic value. Moreover, Marxist cooperative work was reconsidered not just as an economic alternative, but also as a tool to train in the masses a new type of society based in solidarity and not in material individual rewards. In addition, Che Guevara's inspired thinkers indirectly defended loud tech as a consequence of their opposition to the division between intellectual and manual work. That's it.
Thank you, Pancho. Charlotte?
Thank you. Well, good morning, and thank you very much to the organizer of this very interesting symposium. Okay. Is that okay? Yeah. So my contribution to this discussion lies in the historical perspective I would like to bring. My point of view being the one of specialists of the global north of Europe. I'll center my talk on irregular self-built neighborhoods, on unequipped subdivisions of land, not considering 19th century British signification of the word slums, that is inner city slum, no? Because I don't think it's useful here to open the already diverse, very diverse reality which falls under UN Habitat current definition of slums. As another preliminary remark, I just want to remind a point which is very obvious, but which we tend to forget sometimes. Auto-construction on unplanned land subdivisions has been historically the main way of building cities, rather than planned extensions. Now, from this starting point, my first question is when and why neighborhoods built that way started to diverge from others and to be identified as such. Part of the answer, I think, is when plans, projects, and their subsequent law and regulations were designed. I'll take here two 19th century and beginning of 20th century European examples. Paris' insalubrious banlieue grew contemporary to Haussmannization of Paris, which implement different regulations for the new avenues and their sites. And then still in Paris, unequipped peripheral lotissement, that is subdivision, land subdivisions, start to be identified as specific when the 1919 Cornudet law makes planning and building license compulsory to build inside big cities and is not very clear about what is or is not compulsory in the suburbs and doesn't say much about how land subdivisions should or should not be allowed in suburbs. If we take now Madrid's case, Madrid's barrios de extrarradio grew as a consequence of the 1860 ensanche plan, which designs and strictly regulates a new urban zone for urban extension. Outside the border of this new official urban zone, there is no specific regulation for subdivisions and building, no procedures, no administrative disposal for urbanization. So subdivision starts with no paving, no lighting, etc., and give birth to working class, insalubrious new peripheral neighborhoods. My point here is that unequipped poor peripheries are the paradoxical but natural consequence of differential regulation according to the space. Why? Well, just because as soon as there is an administrative spatial border separating two spaces with different qualifications, land price diverge dramatically. That is the case of Haussmannian avenues, of Paris versus banlieue, etc. And the cheap land is the natural place for low-income people residents. This happens obviously in the places where there is an important pressure of low-income people in need of housing and no existing affordable housing for them. According to the cases, these new unequipped self-built extensions are or are not formally illegal. Sometimes there's just no specific regulations for a space which does not interest public powers nor important economic actors. That was the case here in Madrid. What happens when regulation is adopted to be applied everywhere, not creating zones in a context of massive shortage of affordable housing? Well, it tends to relegate auto-construction and unequipped subdivisions further into illegality. That is what happened massively in many cities in the 1950s, which is a period of important public intervention on the city and of migrations toward the big city. Now, I'm not saying that things would go better without planning and regulation. But since these neighborhoods existed before. But what's new is their identification as different and problematic. I also want to insist on the fact that this complementarity of the official city and the irregular city, if I may call them like that, goes much further than the real estate market. It is also economic and social. The migration to the city of the people who find a place to live in the irregular neighborhoods is obviously connected to the city's modernization. In Madrid's case, for example, there's lots of archival evidence that people living in the extrarradio peripheries work in the morning on the modern ensanches building sites, and in the afternoon they work to building their little house in the periphery. Both cities are completely interdependent, as Brody said yesterday, actually. The second question I want to discuss is the attitude of the public powers towards these new neighborhoods and its evolution. First, I'd like to deconstruct the usual narrative for these historical cases, which goes, well, you know, Haussmann was very concerned about modernizing the city center of Paris and forgot to consider the banlieue. Or parcelaciones periféricas grew as an unwanted and unforeseen consequence of the ensanche project. Somehow these neighborhoods are considered as limits to the general success of these urban policies, which created new bourgeois urban space. All the narratives explain that both lotissements parisiens and parcelaciones periféricas grew outside or at the margin of public control. However, close examination of archival material showed that this is not the case. Since the very first plots were sold and houses built, the transactions were registered, the municipal authorities were aware of what was going on. They sometimes allow them by written papers, sometimes verbally. Unwritten practices of government were progressively established by public authorities, functioning as unwritten or sometimes even written rules. In Madrid's case, for example, the municipality delivers formal building permits for these peripheral subdivisions, but with a special clause saying that this building permit did not give right to ask for any urban amenity and did not give right to any kind of indemnization in case of expropriation. This special clause and these practices of government were often contradictory to the law, especially the property law, and contradictory to municipal regulations regarding establishment of urban amenities or regarding streets, public and private streets. But municipal agents, as well as councillors, underline the social function of these neighborhoods in housing the needed workforce migrating to the city, and the fact that they happen in a place of low interest. Anyway, So in both cases I've been discussing, these neighborhoods are not only tolerated, they are the necessary complement to the modern and bourgeois city in construction. In the Spanish case, urban amenities will progressively be established in these peripheral neighborhoods provided by public authorities, breaking the written municipal rules, and it happens with exceptional measures generally following personal relations, and this system of government roots a specific relation of powers. So this way of consolidating these neighborhoods without ever regularizing their situation, in the Spanish case, the French case is different, this way of consolidating them and at the same time maintaining them in their legal precariousness becomes a system of government. It is cheaper in the short term, but potentially very costly in the long run. And the longer it lasts, the more difficult it is to put an end to this way of governing. So to conclude this second point, I want to underline the fact that these historical irregular peripheries have not only been tolerated, but they have been constructed as both a full part of the city, well-rooted in time, and at the same time as places of secondary urban citizenship. By maintaining them in their juridical precariousness, residents of these neighborhoods, who happen to be low-income family and migrants, will not have the same urban rights than residents in the regular city. Finally, if I still have 1 minute, the third and last question I wanted to raise was when and why this way of administrating these neighborhoods changes and when reject starts. And tolerance ceases. Well, comparison between cases show that there are some important common factors. So I'll be short, don't worry. Public powers generally decide that these neighborhoods are not tolerable anymore or not useful enough anymore, at least in some parts of the city. First, when collective representation of what the modern city should be are too far away from the way of life in these neighborhoods. This is pretty obvious. Second, when planning and urban regulations grow and thus relegate self-binding on irregular and unequipped subdivisions further into illegality, and as a consequence, further into legal and as a consequence, material precariousness. This explains, again, that in many places in the 1950s, which are moments of development of public intervention on the city and of urban growth, new words are coined to name shanty towns, bidonville, etc., and specific policies targeting them are designed. The third and last factor I would like to discuss for these neighborhoods reject is the fact that their existence and development enter in conflict with certain political imperatives. I'll give a few examples. Italian fascist government in the 1920s or Francoist government in Spain in the 1940s and 50s want their capital to show the magnificence of the new regime. So the view of barracks becomes problematic. This will lead to the first eradication plans in these two cities, targeting specific zones of barracks on the main access roads. Second example, French bidonvilles in the 1950s are mainly inhabited by foreigners and especially North African from Algerian colony. So as the Algerian war starts, bidonvilles control become a military issue, a military priority, which leads to the first eradication plans. There are many other cases of similar suspicion for the residents leading to eradication operation. Then, much more commonly, building economic policy often conflicts with the extensive use of land made by shanty towns, but you all know that because this happens a lot nowadays. So what used to be cheap, uninteresting land becomes interesting. This is the case of lots of cities in the 1950s and even more in the 1960s and more generally in period of real estate boom. And this is very common now. Now to conclude on these historical experiences I've brought to our debate, I don't pretend that they are European or 19th century equivalent to what's going on now in some cities of the global north. But still, I think that what's going on can usefully be thought in the continuity of this long history of irregular self-built peripheries. I think it helps not consider this phenomenon as specific to the global south or as specific of nowadays globalized economy, as some people want to pretend. And close examination of these historical cases helps think, I think, how much the development of these kind of neighborhoods and their and their diverse trajectories are directly connected to public intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. And thanks, Peter, for your upcoming presentation.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. As you can see, my title here is Slumification of Consolidated Informal Settlements, a Largely Unseen Challenge. As was mentioned, I think Chris Herbert mentioned this in terms of the terminology of slums. From the beginning of my research some 40 plus years ago, I've always found the terminology of slums intensely troubling. For some of the reasons that are already mentioned already by the panelists, ties into negative planning and historical social constructions that invoke and legitimize eviction and urban development schemes, as we saw in the United States, as we've seen in Europe. It's also very unnuanced. Slum housing markets vary with different levels of deprivation, different social constructions in those countries, different policy framing in those countries, different opportunities for upgrading and so forth. And my work kind of tied in the early 1970s along the lines of Peter Lloyd's 1976 volume, Slums of Hope and Slums of Despair. My own work really focusing upon slums of hope, if you like, in Mexico, Latin America, building off people like Alejandro Portes' work talking about rationality in the slum and how these were rational responses to poverty, to the lack of housing production for low-income populations and so forth. So we were a part of a group of scholars in the late 60s, early 70s that were really trying to change the way of thinking about these informal, irregular settlements in terms of trying to see them as the mainstream, to support self-help, upgrading, consolidation, and so forth, along the lines of people like John Turner and so forth were arguing back in the early mid-70s. And then, of course, the paradigm shift really that occurred around the 1976 first UN Habitat Conference really, I think, began to shift toward new policies of upgrading sites and services, regularization of property titles, and so on and so forth. So I was very much a part of that that group of scholars. That said, once the mainstream had or the policy scenario had changed, several of us also had certain concerns that we were perhaps in danger of looking at irregular settlements, informal settlements through rose-tinted spectacles, and it was essentially romanticizing, if you like. And some of us have misgivings, basically misgivings that this is self-help reproduced labor power cheaply. It allowed the state to abrogate its responsibilities, facilitated clientelism, social control, ignored the intense social costs of living in unserviced, poorly serviced settlements, and so forth. So we developed a book, right? Edited this book, Self-Help Housing: A Critique, which really embodies some of those arguments. So really this is a case of really having promoted the change, the paradigm shift, only then to sort of hold back and say, hang on, slow up a little bit. There are certain major significant problems with promoting self-help. It's basically a case of, academic case of having one's cake first and then eating it afterwards, if you like. In terms of my more recent work, since moving to Texas some 27, 28 years ago, I've been looking really at poverty and self-building, self-help housing in the United States, in colonias along the U.S.-Mexico border, quite widely described these days, but also more broadly informal homestead, what I call informal homestead subdivisions outside of the border, across outside of major cities, Austin, Houston, Dallas, and across the South. Very similar to Colonia, self-built, self-organized housing in the United States. And I mentioned this, I'm not going to have, I don't know, obviously this is going to be a part of another conversation over the next 2 days, I hope. But basically, this relates, I think, very much to a quickening of interest in the United States about informality in the United States, housing informality, economic employment informality in the United States. And it goes back to, I think, what Charlotte was basically saying just now, that informality is alive and well in the North, and in this case, in the United States. But as I say, that will have to be part of a longer, a further discussion. And I know that several of the presentations, Jake Begman, a colleague from Texas, will be talking about this in his work. So more specifically, what I want to do is to flag the work that we've been doing over the last 10 years as part of the Latin American Housing Network, which I coordinate. It's a 9-country study which focuses upon consolidated informal settlements. So it's the irregular informal settlements that began something like 25, 30, 40 years ago in Latin America. So largely ignored by planners and policymakers. Planners and policymakers focus upon the more recently formed informal settlements and the planning interventions and so forth. No one's really thinking about what about those settlements that are successfully consolidated, successfully perhaps in quotation marks. What are their demands? What are the housing structures, the household structures living in those settlements and so forth? And the challenges today. And that's where I'm going to be talking a little bit in a minute about some of the slumification, coining a new word, but the slumification process that may well be taking place in those successfully consolidated settlements. And you can see here the book that came out in preparation for Habitat 3, a new generation of strategies and approaches. The new generation of strategies and approaches is, as I say, is not upgrading. It's actually housing and community rehab. What we develop in the book is really not only do the science of those the housing conditions of these consolidated settlements and the households that live within them, but also the planning challenges and largely focused upon housing rehabilitation and community rehabilitation, and I'll show you a couple of features in a minute. What are the features of these areas? Well, we're talking about population stability, at least of the owners. What we're finding in this 9-country, 11-city study is that the average resident have been in place for 25 plus years. 80% of the households are the original households. The parents may have died, but this is the original families that either invaded or purchased. There is a lot of mobility in terms of in and out, churn, if you like, of adult kids moving out for work, moving out for marriage or for union and so forth. There's a lot of rising renting, petty landlord subletting and so forth. So population stability of the owners is the first feature. Second feature is let me just show you this is. This is kind of important. It's just to point out the areas that we're talking about are what I call the inner burbs. It's the first suburbs of settlement in Latin American cities. Essentially, the areas in green here, and here Monterrey, Mexico City, here's Guadalajara, and so forth. Now well located, of course, in the inner ring of those areas. So. Population stability, another feature is substantial exchange value. Clearly these have a use value, ongoing use value for the people who acquired this land, but a substantial exchange value. Properties values vary by country, but we're talking about $50,000 median in Guadalajara for a home, $100,000 in Mexico City, 38,000 in Santiago, Chile, and so forth. So substantial exchange value. but most importantly, ongoing use value. Third feature is the transgenerational aspect of households living in these settlements, the sharing by second and third generation, the children and grandchildren of those original pioneer self-builders, sharing the properties. But the problem is, of course, that the properties themselves developed accretively over time through self-building. Now for 2 or 3 households living in that dwelling or on that lot, the fabric of the dwelling no longer suits the particular household needs. So you get problems of a lack of privacy, inadequate dwelling conditions, and so on and so forth. And those properties have now become very much a patrimony for the children. One of the rationale for acquiring a property was to have a place to live, but also patrimonio para los hijos. It has de facto become patrimony for those children. And what we're seeing and beginning to see is the inheritance of those properties by the second and third generation properties, often inheriting them not changing the property titles to the new owners, if you like, the siblings. So you're getting, having had a regularization of property titles, you're now getting a clouding of those property titles, and that can be problematic if you're trying to leverage financing for rehab, if you like. The location is good, as we've already seen. Especially, if you like, compared with what I think are going to be the slums of the future, which are essentially the mass social interest housing estates way out on beyond the periphery, and which we're already seeing major problems of deterioration of those properties, abandonment of those properties, poor quality construction in the first place, and so forth. In essence, what we're focusing upon these days is not so much the process of consolidation, which is what I've been working on, and many of us were working on back in the 1970s, but really this is the feature. This is essentially the end product 35, 40 years on, where you're getting heavy deterioration. And this is where I think the slumification is beginning to occur, and which I just talk about in the last couple of minutes. This is the nature of, this is Netzahualcoyot, in the east of Mexico City. You can see this is a classic consolidated settlement, very dense population, 2-story, 1, 2, 3-story dwellings, fully serviced, fully regularized, of course. But again, this is the deterioration, this is the environment in which you, unless you have housing rehab and community rehab, you're going to get severe deterioration of the properties. Today, you're also seeing some pressures of displacement of those areas. Some people talk about gentrification. I'm not going to get involved in that, but that's limited to a certain extent. But there is growing pressure. Given the location of these settlements, there is growing pressure from developers to buy out either individual lots or, more specifically, sections of particular blocks that are well located, or parts of settlements that are particularly well located. We see this quite clearly in Chapinero in Bogotá, and so forth. So where is the slumification? Well, the slumification is really in the dwelling deterioration itself, in the high lot densities and the intergenerational demands of sharing parental properties that haven't been adequately recast to accommodate the changing household structure, the second and third generational household structures, the densification of renting by younger low-income households, and the very poor conditions often associated with petty landlord-tenant relationships and with the generation of renting. There's a major push on within Latin America to promote rental housing in Latin America, and that's positive. But we see that much of the rental housing that's embedded within these settlements, either as petty landlord-tenant systems or indeed new tenement housing that's being constructed, is of very, very poor quality. the reproduction of informality through the loss of title, the clouding of titles is making it difficult to make exchange difficult, sale, and reduces the incentives to upgrades. And you can see some of the sort of the housing conditions that I'm talking about here. These are consolidated, successfully consolidated settlements. These are properties that have the values that I've been talking about. But as you can see, high levels of deprivation and need for rehab internally. This is a toilet. You can see the danger, the leakage in terms of the roof and so forth, and the dangers of collapse. You can see here the street infrastructure that's breaking up and so forth. So-called stairs to the next channel. So and the fact that really to date there's lack of housing rehab policies on the agenda, which is why we developed the book in the first place. So as I say, this is where I think the slumification is in danger of occurring. So in short, if these low-income settlements of yesteryear were not the slums of the past, i.e. they were the slums of hope, they are in danger, I think, of becoming the slums of the future and of despair. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for the presentation. And I'm going to provide now just a little bit of room for discussion and conversation. And I welcome both the speakers and audience to not interrupt, but raise hands and jump in as you see it fits. I think it was it's interesting to see to contemplate the very ethereal thread that connects the three presentations that discuss different places and different times and even different concept of issues, yet they have something in common about this oddity of places or the social production of these places. Very interesting that we have not discussed, presentations have not tackled directly, let's say. I mean, we have actually, but they have not solely centered on the physical problems of slums, which is something that at the beginning of the 20th century would be something very, very described of the evils of sanitation and ventilation, etc. But rather we have discussed more social, political, and economical issues that carry some physical consequences. So to put it a bit provocatively, one issue, one question that I have is that this seems to be in a way a subjectless phenomenon, meaning that the agency that produces slums or informal settlements seems to be somehow an ethos of time, a type of zeitgeist. Perhaps Charlotte has been the one that has pinpointed more clearly public institutions in a way as the ones enabling or regulating these spaces by the very formalization of these rules, by merely depicting what function spaces should have and creates this difference. But in Pacho's presentation and somehow, and Peter, it seems that the time in a way enabled slums to occur as modernization took place. So one question that I would have is, in a way, what would you say, who would you say is the subject of this history? Who is actively, in active voice somehow creating this history? Is it modernity? Is it capitalism? Is it the social contract? Or none of them? There is no. Perhaps the question has no point. And I make this question to in a way try to trace what is common in the presentations, to try to see what is the historical thread that we are narrating, besides the disparate issues about problems in urbanization. What is the general historical subject that we are describing? It's a very general question, but I hope that it leads to some comments.
a lot. I don't know.
Wow. So who is the subject of the history? That's a complex question. I would say it's the people, but what I've been trying to explain is that the way city is produced does not, so the way this city is produced does not change in the from the residents and the actual builder's point of view. What's shifting is the external representation of it, and that's so. I think that would be my answer to your question.
Okay, I think that the of course it's a very complex question, but anyway, I didn't speak about another Marxist concept of problem, that was the relation between the city and the countryside. So there are many, of course, many different positions on this topic, but for me, this is it's very important because it's a way to understand, in my opinion, that slums are not a problem, neither a solution. That the problem is outside. The problem is global and territorial. I think that slums are the result of some productive relations and some political systems that produce territory and tensions in the territory that produce, for this reason, the mobilization from people from the countryside to the concentrated in the cities. So. I think that this is the subject or the point we should focus on our attention, because otherwise, and this is why I address my presentation in this way, because otherwise we will be creating ideologies and justifications of the state of things which are in the present, and not going to the real point. Yesterday there was a very interesting for me commentary on the question of agriculture, and I live in Argentina, and there we have a lot of concentration of the production in the countryside with big companies or big amounts of capital, mainly nowadays in soya, for instance. So it destroys absolutely the tissue of the social tissue in the countryside that produced the mobilization from people from the countryside to the city, probably without wanting to make this move. And more than that, I think that today we have technologies to respond to the question, to one important question that in the 19th century and in the 20th century could not have any answer. That is the problem, the big, enormous advantages of metropolization. I mean, metropolization means enriching people's life. In 19th century and 20th century, it was impossible to enrich the countryside life because technical problems. Nowadays, this is not anymore a big problem. So we are in front of a new kind of tension between the cities and the territories, and I think that this is probably the problem we should focus on if we want really to find solutions and not merely momentary, I don't know, alibi.
I mean, in my feeling, it is very much associated with industrialization, urbanization, and poverty. The fact that that industrialization process, in Latin America at least, has not led to sort of the trickle down and the creation of a broadening middle class, I think has left a lot of people in poverty. who either have to rent or have to find alternative mechanisms in terms of becoming homeowners and self-building, and the whole self-building process is essentially that. If you think about it, I mean, the migration that Jose Francisco was talking about, the migration was essentially tied to industrialization strategies that sucked people from the rural areas into the cities as waged workers, formal workers, but low-waged workers. And so the element in terms of their wage that you talked about, that Marx talked about in terms of that would cover housing, was not being covered. By the same token, the scale was such that governments couldn't respond. They tried to respond. It was totally inadequate, and indeed inadequate both quantitative terms and qualitatively, John Turner and others would argue. And so you get a period of just basically what do governments do, and this is where it relates to, I think, the second subject of the slumification, if you like, or the creation of these settlements is essentially the way they were portrayed and constructed by policymakers. So you get policymakers first trying to intervene to eradicate. That doesn't work. So what do? They do non-policies, laissez-faire, basically, just ignoring, turning away from these areas, and then as the ideas of regularization and upgrading and so forth, they begin to intervene to support these areas. So I think the subject is essentially one of the creation of poverty, but also the ways in which planning and public officials view these areas and respond to them.
I think we already have questions. I'm going to let the conversation go. We'll start.
So I think I'm very sensitive as a historian to the so what questions. So I listen to people who are either coming from the field of history or talking about past experiences. And I think that in this kind of room, the main question is, how do these perspectives help us to redefine the problem space that everyone else here is concerned with? And I'd like to point to a couple things. I mean, I think that Peter Ward's presentation is in some way very clean in the sense that the problem space is that people are living in conditions that are undesirable, right? And over generations you have this problem that any neighborhood has of how is it that you create physical conditions for more people in more densely settled places that are adequate and keep their health and well-being together. And so that, I think it's really good to just be reminded of the basic nature of that problem, which is something that anybody in these neighborhoods deals with every day. But I'd like to go to something that's a little bit more abstract that comes from the other two comments, and I phrase this as sort of a suggestion of a problem that we can all think about, and I'm curious what you think of this. I mean, I think in the case of Charlotte's, and we've been collaborators on a project where a lot of people are discussing all these ideas, so I'm probably reading more into it than we can see from the very brief presentation here. But I think that what it draws our attention to is that in a way, the regulation of cities is part of the history of liberalism and institutional equality itself. And part of what you do when you declare, or when you create urban regulations that not everybody who lives in an urban environment can meet, what you're really doing is drawing a legal line that says we're going to apportion public resources only to people who are within this realm of legality. And everybody else is going to be relegated to a kind of subcitizenship. I mean, that's really the decision that you're making, is about how to allocate public resources, how to allocate protection, how to allocate vulnerability. And so what that leads us to as a problem is that the problem of a slum, the problem of a favela, whatever you want to call it, is not only the problem of degraded physical conditions, but it's the problem that the public government doesn't take the same responsibility for upgrading those conditions that they do in other places, because they've decided that these places, because they're illegal, are spaces where people don't have any kind of legal claim to public resources and public space. And so I think that if we think about that as being the core, in some sense, of a lot of the aspects of the problem, then we start thinking in a more systematic way about what kinds of policies solve the problems that matter most to people who actually live in these areas. And then I was super interested in the comments about the leftist history, and from yesterday and today, because I think there's another kind of idealization. I mean, if in Charlotte's case, the idealization that we're working with is the myth that there's such thing as egalitarian institutionalized citizenship. From the left, the myth is the idea that somehow you can have an egalitarian and just community simply because it comes from the bottom up. And I think the problematic that's at the center of it that's been very difficult to deal with is how do you create institutional structures of some kind that make sure that minorities and people who are on the bottom end of the hierarchies that exist within these communities, how do you create some version of voice for them, some way that they can actually be participants and not just spoken for by the leaders of their community, or not, as oftentimes happened, exploited by the people who are the more elite members of those community. And that's another problem space that oftentimes I think gets lost in these discussions because we tend to make this dichotomy between bottom up and top down. So I'm just curious what you think of those ideas and how they fit into the larger picture. Thanks.
Do you want to? We'll take another question and then get a round of answers and then continue up there with the next one.
Thanks, Marty Chen. I have just a follow up on the who decides what's legal and illegal and draws the line, because I work on the urban informal economy, and somebody's drawing the line that a street vendor is criminal and the new mall being built right next door is fine, right? And somebody's making those decisions. But I want to ask Peter a question about the consolidated neighborhoods. And when did that consolidation take place? Did it take place when they were sort of ignored? Did it take place largely when there was the upgrading? And, you know, what was the wider political economy, time and space that was allowing for this consolidation? Because it would be interesting to know. And also a question of urbanists more generally, that a lot of the big slums were originally on the periphery of the city, right? But the city has grown beyond them, right? And are those the ones that are being consolidated? Which ones are being consolidated and which ones are still being treated as highly illegal?
Let's take a round of answers and then we'll continue with 2 or 3 questions. That's okay. So.
Well, I think that yes, you're right, and I agree with you. And I think that there is an idealization of this bottom-up kind of relation. And my concern is that probably I am an idealist, but anyway, I think that the question is about wages and citizenship. I mean, it's not that people living in slums deserve a kind of special, qualified citizenship. Is the slum citizenship. No, I think that what they deserve is to be a citizen like others, and to have the right to move from one side to another, to leave the neighborhood, to not be anymore a slummer, and to be a citizen into the city like myself or others. So, but I think that there is the left way of thinking had created the idea, the terrible for me idea of the identity of slummers, and to celebrate the identity of slummers. So in this way, creating or promoting a new kind of qualified citizenship. So this is something that had to do with institutions, that has to do with the disappearing or the presence of the state, not just for creating the condition to have good wages like everybody, but also to promote and maintain through many things. Of course, we know education and many other devices, social devices, the constituencies of these people, or as everybody, as citizens. So this is what I think about this kind of move. And this is my critique to this point of view from there.
Please.
Yes, just very quickly to Brody and Marta about the regulation drawing the line. I think we've been talking about time, but the other point is context. So there's time and there's context. And according to the general context, according to the local context, the same regulation will draw a line where lots of people stay out, or in other places, there are few people who stay out. but the point is, like, regulation on urbanization. We could look at regulation on urban planning and on urbanization and on building is a way of giving right to good urban living conditions. And every time you give a right, you have to define who has the right and who has not. Who else? I don't know how you said that in English. Ayant droit. So who are the people who have these rights? So I mean, that's the story of law, no? You have the people who a law gives a right, and you have to decide who has the right and who has not. So I think we can think of urban regulation in the same way as, for example, like social protection, or when if I take this historical example, which I think is very clear, when social protection was organized in Europe, it was organized at the same time than national citizenship was organized, and the law on social protection would decide whether strange foreigners were inside or outsider for this law. So I think it's the same functioning, like regulation draws line between insiders and outsiders, and there's no way to escape that.
I think, Pancho, do you want to add one thing?
Just to answer the other question, or to comment. I think there is the reality is that slums are not anymore. I like the idea of urbanized. I mean, it's not suburban necessarily. So this point introduces us in the question of difference between slummers, which is something that we usually don't consider. They are poor slummers and they are rich slummers. It's not about, I think we tend to generalize and to look at everybody in the same situation. And there is a question precisely about the location. It's not the same thing. In Buenos Aires, and I think Harabi is the same case. It's not located in the periphery. It's located in a central, very important, probably the most expensive land in Buenos Aires are located exactly in the best side of the city, near the most beautiful neighborhoods, and in regards to the transportation system, etc., etc. So the value of this land is enormous, and the pressures from the real estate interest on this kind of territory is absolutely different from others that are really in the periphery without any kind of support. And the attention is normally given more to these central slums than to the peripheral, the poorest ones. So I think that there is also it should be important to consider this point of the inequalities, the internal inequalities in slums and slummers, and not to talk about generalization because they are not true. Just that.
If I can just build off that, I mean, in fact, you're talking about the villas. The villas are only about 6% of the low-income consolidated housing in Buenos Aires. It's the loteos populares, which are in the periphery, that is much more frequent. Same with the favelas in Brazil. It's the favelas are a smaller universe, housing universe than the loteamientos, which are in the periphery and so forth. But going back to your specific question about this consolidation process, it really is over time, the consolidation process will take 15, 20, 25 years. Used to take that sort of time. It now actually occurs more quickly because there's a much more routinized response from planning authorities to regularize, provide title, and so forth. So it is, but it is through self-building. They start at the periphery, of course. These are informal settlements that start at the periphery. And as the city is expanded, they're now located in what I call the first suburbs, these inner burbs. They are the first phase of suburbanization, 60s and 70s, associated with rapid urbanization. they're now located there, and just as you mentioned in terms of the villas, they're now in, and you saw on the maps, they're well located, they're close to transportation systems in the intermediate ring. And so that's precisely the reason why there is a growing interest in terms of more efficient land uses and flipping those developments, not through eradicating them, but basically buying them out. And so developers are actually buying out certain parts of settlements in order to develop high-rise residential developments and so forth. And I mentioned the Chapinero example of in Bogota. Yes, there are ongoing creation of new settlements at the periphery of these cities, but the pace of that is slowed as industrialization has slowed, urbanization is slowing, demographics are slowing, and so forth. So as planning interventions become much more effective in terms of screening and preventing informal settlement from developing from the periphery. You've also had in the last 15, 20 years a whole switch in many cities in terms of the promotion of these mass social interest housing estates at the periphery and peri-periphery, beyond the periphery. So there's the pace of new informal settlements is in fact slowing. But these are the consolidated settlements of 20, 25 years ago.
Thank you. We have, I think, one more question there and a second over the right.
Yeah, I'm hoping that the panel will comment on the informal economy in slums, focusing on two specific related issues. If I improve my dwelling, to what extent can I, quote, sell it, even in the absence of property rights, if I leave or want to leave? And a not unrelated issue is, to what extent do gangs function as informal governments and police forces and help with the enforcement of informal property rights?
Thank you. We have another question over the right.
Okay. So my question is primarily focused on the idea of low-income versus high-income informal settlements. So in a lot of these areas, you can have a decent quality of life in terms of communal activities, in terms of a strong community of people, which very often doesn't exist in regular, or as Charlotte said, the regular city. So what role do you think civil society and governments can play, especially policymakers, to improve the quality of life in slums in terms of the physical infrastructure, while still maintaining that fabric within the community? I don't know if that makes sense. That's the first part. And the second thing that I also ask about is that very often governments take the perception that they should remove these slums completely and reuse the land, as you were saying. So, so how do you think that plays in with efforts of civil society to upgrade informal settlements? So my question is essentially, who do you think should be doing what? Which is very broad, because I understand there are lots of factors at play here, but it's always a contradiction, and I think there should be space for people to work together more, because it's not going to happen either from policymakers or from civil society. So where do you think there is space for them to work together to improve the situation?
Thank you. I think.
Should I just kick off on the selling aspect? As I said in my talk, these were seen as a patrimony for the children, essentially, and de facto it's becoming that. In most countries there has been a systematic process of providing legal title to these property owners, the original property owners that began informally. So most of these dwelling units, and I've talked about some of the prices and values of these properties, they are titled. One of the things I also raised is that clarity of title is actually being undermined as you pass from one generation to a second generation, because of conflicts because of lack of wills or lack of formal transfer, conflicts between children and so forth, so that having been titled, those properties are now in danger of losing the clarity of title. Whether they have title or not, the properties have value and therefore could be sold if you can set aside the ongoing use value for the adult children and so forth. They could be sold. Trouble is that who's going to buy those properties? Because if you're talking about $50,000 and there's no mortgaging availability to negotiate a buyout of that property, then you're effectively you can't sell. And in fact, so the market becomes stuck. And we see this not only in Latin America neighborhoods, but we see this in the colonias that I was talking about, that I hinted at in terms of my presentation. Colonias in South Texas, informal subdivisions, and so forth. If people need to move for work reasons, or they get divorced or whatever, they're faced with the real difficulties in terms of capacity to sell those properties because there's no financing mechanism to facilitate buyouts. Unless you happen to live in a particular part of the settlement along the main street where you may get someone with a commercial interest who has the capital to be able to buy you out, the market gets stuck. So in essence, so properties are abandoned, or you get someone else in to rent, or you let it to a family member and so forth.
Thank you. I don't know if the second question. Yeah.
What I don't understand is how do we get to the $50,000 or $100,000 house if there is no one to buy because there is no market for that? So how did you get to this value? I can understand, for instance, that rentals in most of these consolidated areas are humongously high, and there are 2, 3, sometimes even 4% of a alleged value of the housing there, and that is the kind of market that the second store, the third store, whatever make. But if you don't have someone that can buy for 50, how come you get to this figure of 50,000?
Well, it's fairly easy. There are some sales that go on, as I just mentioned. There are certain properties where you can undertake a sale. But basically, if you look at the increasingly as these areas have urbanized and as they've been brought into the tax base and the property register. And if you look at the values of those properties as they are registered in the Registro de Propiedad, you'll see the 50,000. The values, they're usually a little bit lower than the market rate, assuming you could sell them. But this is what these are properties that are taxed, and the assessment value is essentially the ones that you can work off.
And don't you have to add to that the small real estate developers into the slums?
And you know, in the old days, authoritarian regimes, you just evicted. There was no compensation.
Yeah, but nowadays,
nowadays you have to buy, and certain developers are choosing. They're cherry picking certain settlements where they can see the opportunity. And so they will do buyouts, and they'll buy out at the market rate. The trouble is with the 50,000 is not going to be enough to get them a house without them going out to the periphery and so forth.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on my own question. I was quite serious about the role of gangs as an informal government, and noticed that $50,000 is remarkably similar to the value of a luxury car. And so if I have a luxury car that I acquired via the drug trade and somebody wants to leave their dwelling and I want the dwelling, I swap them the car. And no government is involved other than the fact that once I've done the swap, if anybody reneges, there are consequences. Also notice that renting is a way of extracting value out of a property and hence a form of sale. I don't much care whether or not, but if you're the landlord, then you have to be around to collect the rent. And so once again, you come into the mechanisms by which rent is collected, which are probably a little different than we're familiar with in more regularized economies.
Thank you. I think that I'm going to try to, rescue one point that perhaps as the last question that we had. I don't know if one of the questions that we had around the categorization of low-income and low-income settlements as a potential contradiction that exists in practice, in policies in which by upgrading settlements, basically it's the problem of gentrification. By upgrading settlements, what you are doing is displacing, inducing displacement of settlements. And I don't know if the question was related to how do you avoid that internal conflict, where wherever you point public institutions is where citizens have to fly. I don't know how much that might be part of this debate or of further debates, but I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Well, this is a permanent historical fact. Every time you... sorry. No, I was just saying that this is a permanent historical fact. Every time you upgrade a place and an asset, well, it becomes the value increases. So I think this is true all the time. So the question being what to do, then I have no answer.
That is a fair answer. One last question, and I think we'll try to.
I've the introduction done by Jorge was and the other by Peter and by Charlotte was mainly concerned with countries that the urbanization process was related to the industrialization process. But what we have seen now in the world, especially in sub-Saharan countries, African sub-Saharan countries, is urbanization without industrialization. Yeah. So we have this not lumpen proletariat as Marx, because they are not lumpen proletariat, coming to cities. So how do we frame this out of, because obviously this is not the conceptual framework that you've been working is not applicable in these countries, especially when they live out of oil or minerals or extraction, which is where surplus value is being produced.
I'm not sure it is that simple. I mean, like the Madrid case I've been speaking, it's a case of urbanization without industrialization. So it's not, well, yes, basically it's about services, administration, and about crisis of agriculture and of rural societies. So there are also, at least European precedents to I think the industrialization model of urbanization, which has been very important, I think it's probably an English British bias in our way of thinking, with lots of other examples, or South Italy, Italian cities. So I'm not sure it's African cities are the only historical examples. I wouldn't be so sure.
And I think, can I just add that in Latin America, it was industrialization in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Contemporary today, it's essentially service sector, low-wage service sector jobs, informal sector jobs. So that's really where that's the nature of the labor market that is embedded within ongoing informal settlement creation and embedded within the consolidated settlements that exist. In Africa, yes, you don't have the industrialization. You do have much higher levels of deprivation in terms of low-income settlements, slums. But the workers basically are, to the extent that they're employed, they're in service sector. Large numbers obviously are in the informal sector with high levels of underemployment.
I agree with you. But I think that this is why some theoreticians talk about marginal population. But I think that there is I come back to the problem of space, territorial space, and the lack of equilibrium in the territory. So if you don't care about the countryside and the small peasants in the countryside, and you concentrate resources in one point, everybody will go to that point. It's not about industrialization or not. It's about concentration of resources and not dispersion of resources. And I think that this is why I insist that I think this is the big problem: how to consider the whole space, including extra national space, in the equation. So it's not just about industrialization.
Thank you, Pancho, and all of you for participating and for the interesting questions. We can continue the discussion, which I think was leading towards a good moment. We have to finish now, and we will reconvene at 11 with the next panel. So thank you again for all of your presentation.